Ray, I'm going to take that as a cue to proceed. And here we are. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining in. We're pleased to have you join us for the California Current Acidification Network Ocean Acidification Roundtable discussion for May 2019. The title of today's presentation is The Environmental Cost of Dinner. This series is hosted by the California Current Acidification Network. In short, the series is intended to create a direct dialogue among industry members, natural resource managers, and scientists within the California current ecosystem. With awareness of and access to the research and its applications and uses, the participants will be able to collaborate to better understand and adapt to ocean acidification moving forward. I'm Brad Warren. I'm a member of CCAN and the webinar committee. I'll be moderating today's discussion. We also have Teri King from Washington Sea Grant online, who'll be running the logistics of the webinar and taking over if my connection goes unstable again. During the presentation, attendees will be in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type questions related to technical issues or questions for the presenter into the questions box at the bottom of the control panel on the right of your screen. We will be monitoring incoming questions and we'll respond to them or pose them to our speaker after the presentation. We are also recording this session and we'll share the recording on the CCAN website. We're very excited to have Dr. Ray Hilborn speaking with us today. Dr. Hilborn is a professor in the School of Aquatic, Fisheries, and Sciences, specializing in natural resource management and conservation. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in food sustainability, conservation, and quantitative population dynamics. Ray has authored several books, including Overfishing, What Everyone Needs to Know, with Ulrich Hilborn in 2012, Quantitative Fisheries Stock Assessment, with Carl Walters in 1992, The Ecological Detective, Confronting Models with Data, with Mark Mangle in 1997. He has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles. Ray has received the Volvo Environmental Prize and the American Fisheries Society's Reward for Excellence, the Ecological Society of America's Sustainability Science Award, and the International Fisheries Science Prize. I'll hand it over to Ray. All yours, Ray.
Okay, thanks very much, Brad. Let's see, I just pushed that. Let's make sure this is working for everybody. Is it, let's see. You see my slideshow?
Oh. I do.
Okay, then I assume everybody else does. Okay, Brad, thanks very much. And Teri and the CCAN group, thanks for the opportunity to talk about something that I actually gotten really excited about in the last few years, which is really understanding the environmental cost of what we eat. Because one thing that unifies us all is we eat, and for many of us, it is probably the most significant impact we have on the environment, that is the production of our food. Now the subject really has, the last 10, 15 years, I would say it really got kickstarted by Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. And he dealt with three issues, questions of nutrition and health, animal rights, and environmental impacts. And I'm going to just address the third topic, the environmental impacts. But I may, if I have time, I may dip into the others just a little bit. Now, my interest in this got started, I know exactly when it was. It was in January of 2010, and I was doing work on the Serengeti wildebeest, which is a long-term project I've had since before, actually, I got into the fish world. And the picture there is Marcus Borner, who at the time was the director of conservation programs in Africa for the Frankfurt Zoo. And I was working in his office, and he pulled out this copy of Time magazine from November of 2009. And I said, Ray, I'm an environmentalist. Should I stop eating fish? So I took him seriously, and I said, well, Marcus, if you don't eat fish, what are you going to eat? And he said, well, I'm not a vegetarian. I'll eat more beef, more chicken, and more pork. At the time, I had been following some work of a Canadian scientist, Peter Tidemeers, who had been following fuel use in fisheries, and he and some of his students had been starting to do comparisons across different kinds of food production. So I was aware there was a literature on it, but if we think about what are the environmental costs of food, an obvious one that certainly in the ocean world we are mostly concerned about, I would say, is greenhouse gases, global warming, leading to ocean acidification, et cetera. But other elements of environmental costs of food are water use, pollution from various kinds, fertilizer, pesticides, antibiotic use, soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and then animal rights. Now, if you think about fishing, it really uses minimal, if any, amounts of water, contributes very little to pollution in the sort of the traditional ways. I mean, lost gear is an issue, but it's not it's not generally thought to be a major impact. No fertilizers, no pesticides, no antibiotics, and no soil erosion. But fisheries certainly do impact biodiversity and have animal rights issues. So this is a figure that was available, I think it was published about 2011 or 12, from one of Peter Tidemere's former students, Nathan Peltier. And they were just looking in energy use, but for most, a lot of issues in fisheries, most greenhouse gases come from fuel use. In agriculture, a lot of it comes from that. And so this shows in green various crops. And this is, I think, kilojoules per ton, but it's just all relative energy use. Red is livestock, including milk and eggs. Yellow is aquaculture, and blue is capture fisheries. D is that working largely in the fisheries world, capture fisheries are highly variable. And if you look at the first fishery, small pelagic fisheries, so that's basically sardine, herring, mackerel, anchovy fisheries, they have an unbelievably low fuel use per amount produced. In fact, it is lower than any of the crops. And some of the other fisheries also look pretty good. Where's demersal, the low and impact demersal fisheries, and are right down there with the plants, well below livestock, well below aquaculture, typical aquaculture. But some things are really very high. So for instance, lobster fisheries tend to look quite bad. So I knew this data was available, and I began essentially collecting all of the published studies that calculated sort of standard outputs. Greenhouse gases is one, energy use, release of eutrophying substances, mostly phosphorus, nitrogen, and also release of acidifying compounds. And those have been, in fact, we found several hundred studies of animal source products. And last year, a group of us published this paper where we just compared some of the metrics across different animal source foods. So that's livestock, aquaculture, capture fisheries. And the four metrics that we had lots of analysis of was energy use, greenhouse gases, nutrients, and acidifying compounds. And so for greenhouse gases, this is a summary broken into large aggregate groups of aquaculture in red, livestock in yellow, and capture fisheries in blue. And the y-axis is the kilograms of carbon produced per 40 grams of protein. And we chose 40 grams because it's more or less the recommended daily human consumption of protein. And notice that the y-axis scale is logarithmic, that or close to logarithmic, that we go from 0.1 to 50. And the clear winner in this for low greenhouse gas output per unit of protein production is small pelagic fisheries, but followed not too far behind by mollusk aquaculture, whitefish, and salmon aquaculture. Salmon farming isn't too far behind. Some forms like catfish production, for the data sets we had, really were one of the worst. In fact, on average, they were the worst. Tilapia and shrimp farming are not very good. Beef is distinctly worse than chicken and pork. If we looked at nutrient production, the picture's somewhat similar, although mollusks are actually negative. Mollusk farming, they actually soak up nutrients. Small pelagic fisheries, there's almost none. Large pelagic fisheries, I mean, the fisheries in general don't produce much. The thing that much aquaculture and livestock share is their big impact is the production of the feed. The reason then in general, the aquaculture livestock impact is proportional to the food conversion ratio. So it can convert feed more efficiently into protein than does beef, and also typically a little bit, well, actually salmon's a little better than chicken and pork. And I think if I go back, that's probably why salmon wins on the greenhouse gas end of things. So that's a quick look at things like greenhouse gas. But if you really are in the fish world and you deal with any of the issues associated with choice of fish to eat, and think about the Marine Stewardship Council certification, Monterey Bay aquariums, what they have typically looked at is to some extent, it's the sustainability of the harvest of the resource. That is, can the stock be continued to be harvested into the future using the Brundtland definition? You know, are our grandchildren going to have the same opportunity to catch those fish? But in fact, that's a relatively small portion of the criteria that most seafood guides use. Most seafood guides use biodiversity impacts, bycatch, impacts on the seafloor, impacts on other species through trophic interaction. That I think I've done the calculations that both for Monterey Bay and Marine Stewardship Council, about 2/3 of their evaluation criteria are biodiversity related. And those 158 or however many studies we found that were published don't really look at biodiversity. In fact, the biodiversity impact is hard to quantify because, in fact, it's very difficult to get more than two people to agree what they mean by biodiversity. And it's not been quantified very much. So I'm going to be able to talk about it in broad terms, but not in super specific terms. I had to put this in, that this, in fact, last Thursday and Friday, I was part of a very small meeting of 8 of us trying to evaluate the biodiversity impacts of food production. And I wanted to look at a scenario where we say, okay, let's stop fishing and produce food by terrestrial sources. And several of the members of the group said, well, nobody thinks we should stop fishing. This is an article that appeared last Friday in The Guardian. And at the time I'd said, well, Sylvia Earle always tells people we should stop fishing. And this is a somewhat ill-informed journalist for The Guardian. I mean, the article itself was full of so much information it rivals Donald Trump. But certainly, you know, there are people who advocate saving the oceans and stopping to fish. So one of the things we were then looking at and have been is, well, what would it take to replace the capture fisheries of the ocean with food, with protein from other sources? And so these are just some simple calculations of how much area it would take if you were to replace the roughly 90 million tons of fish that are caught, and I think it works out to about 17 million tons of protein by producing beef. And it would take about 25 million square kilometers that would have the area 192 times the area of England. And if you were going to do that, most of the new area added to agriculture in the last 30 years has come from tropical rainforests. So it's absurd to think that we could possibly replace fish production with beef production. And again, think about my friend Marcus Borner. He's going to, if he wasn't eating fish, he'd be eating more beef and more pork and more chicken. If you look at poultry, which is much more efficient than beef, it would only take 8 times the area of England. And farmed fish, on average, roughly the same area of England. Now, if you switch to a vegetarian diet, the requirements are less. It would only take 5 times the area of England to replace the protein content of marine fisheries with various grains. And if you go to soy products, it would only take 2.5 times the area of England, which is a very big chunk of the global rainforest. If we look at greenhouse gas impacts, the estimated capture fisheries fishing fleets produce about 179 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. If we were to switch that production to beef, we would increase that carbon footprint by 42 times, poultry by roughly 5 times, farm fish by 5 times, grains by 2.3 times, and tofu by about 1.7 times. So, if you're worried about carbon footprint, we definitely don't want to stop fishing fish in the ocean. Just want to, one of the problems I see with the current discussion about the impact of different kinds of food production is we're in silos. The marine people only think about the marine. The terrestrial people don't think about the terrestrial. Aquaculture tends to be thinking about itself. And when we think about management actions in the oceans, we don't make the connection that, well, if we stop fishing or if we stop fishing certain species, what's going to happen in the food system? And terrestrial, aquaculture, and capture fisheries are all interconnected. These are some interesting pictures of just biodiversity. So again, most increase in food production in recent years has come, the biggest area has been conversion of tropical forests. So like Costa Rica. So that little green screen is a cubic meter. And if you go out into the rainforest of Costa Rica, that is the biodiversity you would find in that cubic meter. A whole bunch of insects, birds, plants. I don't think I see any mammals in that one, but anyway, quite a bit of biodiversity. In contrast, this is what you get in a cubic meter of a cornfield. That biodiversity is essentially gone when you convert land to crops. And what we do in crops is we eliminate the primary producers, that is the plants, and we replace them with an exotic species, in this case corn. And it's how we feed the world. And I'm not criticizing it, but it has a big impact, a big impact on biodiversity. Just to illustrate that, this is data from one of my colleagues, Tim Essington, looking at the change in the trophic structure of the pelagic ecosystem of the Pacific with and without fishing. And I've broken his data into the 4 primary trophic levels. Trophic level 1 is the phytoplankton. Trophic level 2 is zooplankton. Trophic level 3 is small fishes. Trophic level 4 is larger fishes. And in general, the high seas fisheries are largely focused on trophic level 4, primarily tuna and billfish. And so in blue is what you see without fishing. And what I emphasize is, and in orange is with fishing. And essentially, there is no impact on trophic level 1. There is no impact on trophic level 2. Trophic level 3 is actually a little more abundant because we've reduced the predators at trophic level 4 a little bit. But fundamentally, pelagic marine ecosystems are largely untouched by fishing, except if you hone in, and some species will be more abundant, some will be less abundant, but the trophic structure, the function in the ecosystem really hasn't changed much. In contrast, this is data from another one of my friends and colleagues, Tony Sinclair, from Serengeti National Park. And what Tony has done for many years is measure different kinds of biodiversity inside Serengeti Park and outside the park, with outside the park being low-level subsistence farming. And what you see is that outside of the park, 90% of the herbs and grasses are gone. This is just the total biomass of herbs and grasses. 80% of the trees are gone. So that's trophic level 1. In a fishery, we essentially almost never touch trophic level 1. In an agricultural system, even a low-intensity agricultural system, we eliminate trophic level 1. Trophic level 2 is ungulates. In the case, this is wildebeest, gazelles, etc. They're gone from once you leave Serengeti Park, okay? Now, rodents are more abundant. Rodents are twice as abundant. Insects are down about 80%. Insectivorous birds, 90%. And then you get up to the higher trophic levels, they're all down by 90%. So this is just to illustrate how much agriculture transforms an ecosystem compared to fishing an ecosystem. Now, some fishing ecosystems are distinctly more transformed than this, but I haven't seen any ecosystems where trophic level 1 and 2 are significantly changed by fishing. So I want to talk a little bit more about farming. I know a bit about it because I used to own this farm. It's my son farming, driving a tractor, disking a field, and his purpose is to eliminate the vegetation. And that's what farming does. My wife for a number of years was an organic vegetable farmer, which everybody would say, oh, now there is a sustainable form of food production. Okay, is it really sustainable? Is it sustainable compared to fishing? She had about 5 acres of organic vegetables, had 90 CSA customers, sold to 2 farmers market, to a bunch of restaurants, you know, a pretty low impact form of farming. There she is at the farmer's market. But that's what that field I showed you looked like in the spring. And I don't have any data, but I would argue that the biodiversity of that field, certainly the vegetative biodiversity, was essentially gone in preparation for planting those crops. And this is what that field looked like 100 years ago, before we turned it into a farm. So I think we just grossly underestimate the relative impact on biodiversity of farming versus fishing. So let me just say a couple more things. I do want to touch on the animal rights issue because I mean, there's lots of reasons to be vegans, and there is no question that a vegan diet is much lower impact than certainly the average American diet. But a lot of vegans are under the illusion that somehow animals don't die to produce their food. And these are people who are obviously never been on a farm or never seen a field harvested. When my son harvests one of his fields, whether it's for corn or for alfalfa, he chops up hundreds and hundreds of sentient animals, mostly rodents and rabbits, but sometimes I remember once there was a nest of hawks that got chopped up in the combine. When I was going to college, I worked in the pea harvest in Eastern Washington, driving a pea combine, and it was the same thing. We'd go through and we'd chop up lots of animals. So there's no question that even a vegan diet involves killing lots of animals. In fact, this is an article in the Australian Conversation by Mike Archer, who is a professor at University of New South Wales, saying, look, if you're really worried about animal rights, go out and shoot a kangaroo, because you can get a lot of meals out of that rather than killing hundreds and hundreds of rodents for your dinner. Let me see. So how do we minimize the environmental impact of our diet? And you know, in the U.S., we can do so much more because essentially we are so inefficient. Almost all of us could eat a lot less. We eat far more than we need to. We could waste less. You know, roughly nationally or internationally, about 30% of food is wasted. In general, avoid livestock. It's got a lot of, well, it generally has some of the highest impacts. Selective eating of fish, if not all fish, but many fish, most of the fish that you see in a market are quite a bit lower impact than livestock. And in fact, if you want the minimum impact, lower than a vegan diet, it would definitely involve eating of some fish. And growing your own, if you do that efficiently. Don't drive to the garden store 3 times a day to get more stuff, which seems to happen with my wife. She's always running down to the garden store. But growing your own food is certainly a good thing to do. But it does depend a bit on what environmental impacts you're most concerned about. That if you think biodiversity is the most important thing, you would probably make different choices than if you thought greenhouse gases were the most important thing. So I want to just finish with a few myths. I would say is that it isn't always lower impact to eat local. You have to be very careful about that. Actually, shipping food around the world is pretty low impact. There is a study done of comparing lamb for sale in Europe, comparing when it had come from New Zealand and when it was grown in Europe. And coming from New Zealand actually had a lower carbon footprint because New Zealand grows them with a lower carbon footprint, and the shipping cost, I think, was only about 10% of the carbon footprint. A vegan diet does not have the lowest impact. You can do better than that. Farm mussels, small pelagic fishes will do better than a vegan diet, and some whitefish would probably also take you there. Fresh, not frozen, that's very, very tricky. I mean, I eat mostly frozen fish because you typically get higher quality, and it hasn't been put on an airplane. Anything that gets put on an airplane is going to have a bad carbon footprint. I'm certainly not the first person to figure this out. You know, I think lots of people are seeing it, but this is a World War I poster. And one of the reasons that fish tend to look good is you don't have to feed them. And in the aquaculture world, things that feed themselves, like mussels, will have the lowest general footprint. So thanks very much. I just want to do a quick plug for a book that my wife and I have done on sustainable fisheries that is coming out from Oxford University Press next month. And thank you very much. I think, Brett, I'm going to go over to you now, and you are going to, if I can find the button, you're going to take over.
Okay. All right. Well, we have a few things to run through. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you all for being here, and I'm going to open it for questions in a moment and throw out one to start. Ray, one of the responses of people in the seafood industry to this kind of analysis is often to say, well, I'm greener than the next guy down the dock, therefore I should get his market. What do you think? Is that a smart response, or do we need to be going for more systemic change?
Well, I mean, it's a natural response, and and I think I think it's justifiable on the part of fisheries because they've been subjected to so much higher standards than agriculture in particular. That to achieve MSC certification, which an awful lot of certainly our local seafood producers have, you have to meet the principle that you do not transform the structure and function of the ecosystem. And no form of agriculture meets that standard, and no form of industrial agriculture meets that standard. So, I mean, I've been urging fishing groups to tout, their low environmental impact, but it certainly it would be from a global perspective. I mean, all they're doing is shifting markets. They're the real need is to reduce the environmental impact, and one of the purposes of comparisons within production systems, like whether it's within whitefish or within beef, is some forms of production have much lower impact than others, and that's a common use of life cycle assessment. And but I mean, I guess I don't see a problem with any particular group touting its low impact, but recognizing that that's not going to change the world. It's simply going to change their market.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and point out, and we have it up on the screen, that this webinar will be archived at the CCAN website, which is shown on the screen. And I'm going to break from plan a little here and ask Teri to moderate questions, because she can see them better than I can. The way the screen share works, I can't see your questions. So Teri King, can you go ahead and moderate the questions coming in?
Right now, we have nobody asking any questions.
Okay.
So if you have a question, fill it into the box down by your right, and we'll get it up.
And I'll go ahead and ask another then, just to keep things moving. And feel free to send in your questions. We want them. As a result of your research on ecological food impacts of food production, Ray, have you found yourself making different decisions yourself in food and in other aspects of your life?
Yes. I mean, I certain, for instance, whenever I have a chance, I will usually try to eat farm shellfish, just because I just know that that's such a low impact thing, and they're good. I should eat them much more, actually. My son's farm is located about 3 miles from Penn Cove shellfish production, and we really should eat them a couple times a week, which we don't. But I do eat it more. I never was a big beef eater, or certainly my wife hasn't been willing to cook beef in 15 or 20 years. And so I don't eat beef very often, and I feel guilty when I do eat it. I'll almost always go for game. I'm trying to eat less, but more for reasons of personal health than, let me think the problem with people in the academic world is our big environmental impact is getting on airplanes. I'd like to think I'm trying to cut down on it, but I still seem to spend way too much time there.
Understood. That's a hard one. Another question going back to your... go ahead. Teri, take it.
So Libby Hewitt from NOAA, the Ocean Acidification Program, was wondering where she can find the various graphics that you showed, Ray, and super interesting data that she'd like to mull over.
Well, it all depends on, I've given a lot of seminars with some of these graphics. Some of them are in the paper, published papers. Some of them are those. It just depends on which one fundamentally. But I guess look at the recording of this webinar is probably probably the best bet. But I'd be happy to post my slides on the CCAN website if you want to do that.
Great. That would be wonderful. Wait, now all these emails are coming in. Hold on. All right. And Diane Pleshner-Steele, also a CCAN member, says, you know, there's some reference to Peltier, etc., but there wasn't a journal list. So maybe we could get that list of references and amend it to the workshop notice, Ray. How does that sound?
Okay. Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah.
And then from Victoria Parks, she's wondering how large of an impact do you think that shellfish farming / restorations efforts can make on ocean acidification? And she's really interested to hear your bigger picture thoughts. Does that make sense?
You know, I don't think I know enough about what, I suspect that probably not a lot on ocean acidification, just because we're talking the whole world and all the carbon exchange with the atmosphere. But I'm certainly not an expert on that. So I don't know what the
This is Brad. I can add to that. There's some analysis out of VIMS in Virginia that looked at that question, and and others have looked at it as well. They're very good at absorbing nutrients like nitrogen. They're not so good at absorbing carbon. They do absorb some, but it doesn't work out in the net to be a negative carbon removal mechanism because they respire, they produce. So they're animals like we are. And that doesn't make them a solution to the problem of excessive CO2 loading in the ocean to ocean acidification.
Great. All right, so they just keep coming in. Next is there from David Berg, and I believe he's on the East Coast. There's a lot of interest in the Northeast in farming seaweed. Seems that they might have close to zero impact, as there are positive ocean acidification impacts that would balance other impacts. Thoughts?
Yeah, everything I've seen about seaweed and seaweed harvesting and seaweed farming is it's probably absolutely the lowest form of food production that we know about. Haven't seen a lot of studies of it, but you know, it's always more efficient to harvest at the bottom of the food chain, and it's always more, you know. So I doubt that you could do better than seaweed in terms of probably across every metric, because you're obviously not feeding them. You're not fertilizing them, you know, at least marine seaweed. I don't know if they grow seaweed in ponds, but yeah, I would say that's an environmental winner for sure.
We do grow seaweed in ponds. At least here in Washington, we do. We have a large farm that's taking out the nutrients from fish that are grown on the land, and it's filtering that water. But I believe that maybe as a follow-up to our CCAN webinar last year we did on kelping the seas, I believe that the Vulcan project, the Paul Allen project that's going on in Upper Hood Canal should have their results soon. And so that would be interesting to see if they've got that carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus information for us.
Yeah, well, they're almost certainly going to soak up nutrients. And so if you don't have to add nutrients, they're going to win on that. They're going to win on carbon. I mean, as I say, it's hard to imagine they don't win on every score.
Yeah. So Eleanor Graham has a question. There are a lot of documentaries and articles promoting a vegetarian or vegan diet. Do you think that this analysis of what we should eat is mistaken?
Well, I mean, when you say this analysis, I assume she means the people who are arguing a vegetarian or a vegan diet.
Yes.
And I mean, though they have much lower impact than a diet that has livestock, and depending, but when you get out of the livestock world and you get into, for instance, wild game, or wild harvested and some forms of aquaculture, you can do better than a vegan diet. The vegan diet isn't the absolute lowest impact.
Okay.
And shoot a kangaroo. I mean, you just can't do better than shooting a deer if you don't have to drive a truck across the states, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, if you can catch fish efficiently, as certainly many fisheries now do, you can't beat that, because you don't have to convert the land. That's the big problem with a vegan diet, is it depends on soybeans. And if everyone was to become a vegan, where's that soybean going to come from? It's going to come from transforming existing native habitats, primarily probably in rainforest. So if you're worried about biodiversity, a vegan diet may not be the best choice.
Okay, great. So I'm accepting more questions. I have another one as I'm waiting for more to come in. This is from Brian Sheldon, a shellfish grower here in Washington. Do you see any path to get agencies out of their silos and to consider how something that might seem impactful to them, like a pesticide application, is actually the least impactful to the overall environment when it comes to preserving biodiversity and producing food in the least impactful way to the overall environment?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes. I think that people are starting to move out of their silos, and particularly in the aquaculture world, which is not where I've spent much of my time. But 10 years ago, it just seemed like environmental groups were all opposed to almost any form of aquaculture, and I see that changing. That a lot of, as I say, people are starting to think laterally and say, well, okay, what's the alternative and how does this compare to the alternatives? And, I hope that our research group can contribute to that movement to broader comparisons. I know a couple of big global programs on food have not even considered fish. That they just have, food to them is a terrestrial thing, and they do a global trade of food, and they don't think about fish. But I think that's changing. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for shellfish growers. As I say, by all the metrics I've seen, they're right at the bottom of environmental impacts. And yet, again, to use my son's example, my son has 2,000 dairy heifers on his farm. And he needs no permits, except building permits. He has to have a building permit to build a new barn. But right now he's a little bit under the level where he needs a nutrient management permit. Penn Cove shellfish, which is a couple miles away, if they were to try to expand, they would need something like 20 permits. So there's a real asymmetry in the permitting for different forms of food production. And I think probably aquaculture suffers a lot, but I mean, don't underestimate how much fisheries is regulated as well. And fundamentally, agriculture is not regulated nearly as much as aquaculture or capture fisheries.
Great. All right, so Tana Hubbard has a question. While you state that marine/fish nutrients are very low in greenhouse gases, however, we are aware that overharvest is dramatically reducing the sustainability of marine food sources. How do we settle the greenhouse gas impacts versus diversity and abundance of fish protein sources?
Well, I mean, there is a popular conception that fish stocks are declining around the world, and that is absolutely not true. They're actually increasing in half the world. Or another way, roughly for half of the fisheries that produce half of the world's catch on average are increasing, not declining. So the sustainability of much of the world's fish production is not a problem in terms of, say, the Brundtland definition, that is, will our grandchildren be able to keep eating those fish? And essentially, North America, Europe, much of South America, the international tuna fisheries, on average, stocks are increasing, not declining. Southeast Asia is where the big fisheries are that we just know much less, although they're certainly starting to think about managing their fisheries, and I'm sort of, many of us are optimistic they might turn around. So And then there's just no question that even the worst managed fishery has distinctly lower biodiversity impact or something than converting land to agriculture. I just, all you have to do is just look at what agriculture does to the biodiversity. I mean, some fisheries do transform ecosystems a lot, but most don't. Most fisheries take place in places where the ecosystems are still roughly intact. Let's just take one common metric of biodiversity: extinction. No marine fish is known to have gone extinct from fishing. If you take a place like Australia or New Zealand, they've had hundreds and hundreds of terrestrial species that have gone extinct from human occupation, with the dominant form of human occupation, agriculture. Again, it's this asymmetry. Somehow people seem to think that there was more of a biodiversity crisis in the ocean than on land. And that is absolutely not true by any imaginable metric.
Great. All right, I don't see any more questions coming in. I've just posted Dr. Hilborn's email into the email chain, so copy that down if you have any additional questions at the end of the seminar. And we're going to, as quickly as possible, work with Diane to get this presentation loaded to to the CCAN website, so that everybody can view it and watch it again and listen and listen and listen. So if there aren't any more questions, I'll pass it to Brad.
Okay, thank you. And I think with that, we are at the close. You can, once it's posted, you can find this webinar online in a video archive and PDF available at the CCAN website, which is http://ccan, C-CAN dot, I'm not sure I can read that. It looks like info/workshops/webinars/. And you can contact Diane Pleshner-Steele for questions about the CCAN effort. And she is at dplesh, D-P-L-E-S-C-H @gmail.com. And any further questions? The floor is open. If not, we'll close it out.
Thank you, Dr. Hilborn.
Okay, thank you all for organizing it.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody for listening.
Thank you, Teri. Thank you, Ray.